Welcome everybody to the meeting tonight. Hopefully you got the memo, and we are not going to be having butterflies. We're going to be talking birds tonight. So thank heavens for Jesse Huth, who was willing to speak to us at the last minute, and I mean very last minute. I got the email, I think Wednesday, that she wasn't going to be able to help us out. And Jesse stepped up to the plate big time, and I appreciate that. And I will also say that Jim Haley was willing to help us out as well, so I appreciate Jim stepping up. So anyway, we have Jesse Huth here tonight. He was born and raised in the Texas Hill Country and began birding at the age of 6. He quickly joined up with local birding groups and started going on birding trips all over the state. He regularly conducts bird surveys for landowners who maintain wildlife management plans on their properties around Texas. Now, with over 20 years experience birding, he worked as a professional bird guide in the U.S. and abroad. He graduated from Texas A&M with an MS in poultry, welfare and behavior, and a BS in poultry science. When not birding, Jesse runs a poultry consultation business to help small flock owners correctly raise, house, feed, care for, and understand their chickens. And with no further ado, it's Jesse Huth.
All right, so today I'm going to be talking about hill country birding by sight and sound. There's so many dimensions to bird watching out there. It's not just visual, it's not just looking at the birds, it's also listening to the birds. Birds are very vocal creatures, so being able to identify them just by hearing them can be very important and useful to any bird watcher out in the field. But first off, I want to start off by talking a little bit about some basic birding, since I'm sure this is a big and varied class that not everyone out there has been birding before. So I want to address just how you get into birding and some of my processes on how to identify a bird and some birding etiquette. And then we'll get into some specific identification techniques for a few common birds here in Texas. I have plotted out about 50 different species. I doubt we have time to get to all of those tonight, and that is a little bit of an overwhelming amount of birds to discuss, but we'll get to as many as we can. And as has been pointed out, I'm open to questions all throughout the presentation, so feel free to use the Q&A thing or use the Zoom chat. I have a surplus of monitors surrounding me, so I can usually see any of your methods of chat, and I'll be able to answer your questions. So first off, basic birding. Binoculars are useful, but are not necessarily a requirement, especially if you have bird feeders in your backyard and you want to look at the birds up close. You can get some fairly decent close-up views without binoculars. So don't think you have to go out and spend $2,000 on a big fancy pair of binoculars. You can just as well go out and enjoy the birds by just stepping outside. And as I said, sound is very important, and you don't need binoculars to listen to birds. So you can go do auditory bird listening without any type of specialized equipment. You will want some sort of field guide, so you can reference it and determine what bird you're looking at or listening to. Paper field guides are great. I love the Sibley guide, the Peterson guide. There's some specific ones for Texas as well that are really good. But if you just want a general bird guide, I like a full guide to birds of North America, because Texas gets some really weird birds that show up, and being able to reference birds that aren't necessarily supposed to be in Texas can help you identify the birds. And again, you don't even have to go out and spend money on a field guide. There are field guides available for free online. Cornell Lab of Ornithology puts one out. Audubon Society puts one out. They've got pictures, they've got range maps, and most importantly, they have something that a book just cannot give you: sound recordings. You can go on to these online field guides, and you can also get some for your cell phone. There are field guides, Sibley guide for your cell phone, iBird Pro, Audubon app. These are all great things to have on your phone that have audio recordings of the birds that you can reference, because no matter how well they try and write them out in the paper field guides, trying to go from a written out paper text description of a bird song to what you're actually hearing, it's not always the most easy thing to do, especially with very complex songs like the warblers and some of the sparrows. Being able to just pull up a recording and listen to it really, really helps when you're trying to identify that weird bird that you swear you've heard before, but you just can't place it in your head. And there are many, many birds here in Texas, so don't be intimidated by the large number. There's over 650 species of birds that have been recorded here in Texas. So that's a lot of birds to remember, but there are a few common ones that you'll see more often than most of the other ones, at least right here in Central Texas. As you move around the state, you get different varieties of birds in different areas, but that's more a different presentation that I do, birding around Texas. So I won't get too in-depth in that. And the most important thing to learn birding well is to get out and go birding. I know getting out and going places these days can be a little bit difficult sometimes, but even just walking out in your backyard, walking down the sidewalk, finding a little trail that no one else is on out in the woods, and just going out and looking at and listening to the birds is much better than just reading about it or trying to study online. That's great to do. It's great to study, great to get some knowledge beforehand if you are sitting around inside and you want to look up some stuff and do some quizzes. But the best way to solidify these birds in your head is to go out and actually look at the birds. Now, a little bit on bird identification. If you do get a little paper field guide, you'll want to familiarize yourself with your guide. If you have an app, you want to familiarize yourself with the app. Basically to learn how to look up birds quickly. In your apps, of course, you can type the text in, search the name of the bird, or do different sorting mechanisms. But if you have a field guide, excuse me, you will have a taxonomic order is generally how it's laid out. So it's not always perfectly straightforward. It's not usually alphabetical order. And when you first pick up a birding field guide, it can look all weird and you don't really know why the birds are organized the way they are. But that is the taxonomic order that scientists have determined the best way to have these relations to the birds. And as you study it a bit more, you'll start to see the logic behind this layout, why they have all the warblers together, they have the sparrows together. Basically, birds that are more closely related to each other are more closely organized in the field guide. Now, when you see a bird, there is a process that I like to go through to identify it quickly and easily. So the first thing to do is note the general size and shape of the bird. Is it really, really big? Is it little and tiny? Does it have a long tail? Does it have a short, stubby beak? Is it a little fat, chubby thing? Is it really long-necked? Just a general impression of the bird. This can help you narrow it down to a certain part of that field guide, to a certain subcategory of birds. And that's basically all bird identification is taking this giant block of birds and chopping pieces off and eliminating all the birds that are not what you're looking at until you're left with one or two birds that you think might be the bird that you're looking at. And then you can get into the details and figure out exactly what this bird is. So it's a process of elimination. So first off, you just look at the general impression of the bird. Then you check for field marks. And I have a picture here that shows some of the most common field marks, and usually I'll start at the front and go to the rear of the bird. Start at the beak and move backwards. Obviously, if you can't see the beak of the bird, start at whatever part of the bird is visible to you. But look at the beak first. That can help narrow down a lot of different species. Is it little thin pointed beak for eating insects? Is it a big curved beak? Is it a conical seed-eating beak? Narrowing this down just by looking at the beak can help eliminate a lot of different bird species. Then look at the facial patterns. Does it have a line over the eye? Does it have a dark line through the eye? Does it have something on the top of its head? Is it a different colored crown? Does it have a big crest sticking off the top of its head? All these field marks, again, help you eliminate birds that are not the bird you're looking at. Then continue going further back, look at the back of the neck, the belly, the breast, and look at the wings. Are there any bars on the wings? That's a very important field mark that you'll see, because a lot of birds do have wing bars, but a lot of birds do not have wing bars. And sometimes you can have some very similar looking birds, but one will have wing bars and one will not. As you get into some of the more similar birds, like flycatchers, for instance, some of those will have different colored wing bars, and that's an important distinction. Is it a white wing bar? Is it a buffy colored wing bar? Then you just keep going back. Notice if there's any different colors on the primary feathers. Are there any different colors on the rump? There's a little bird that hangs around here, especially in the wintertime, but sometimes they are around in the summertime, called a yellow-rumped warbler. And I bet you can guess what the main field mark on that bird is. It's kind of gray and brown and streaky, but when it's flying away from you, it has this bright yellow patch on its rump. So it's called a yellow-rumped warbler, or as many birders call it, a butterbutt. So look at the rump, see if there's any different colors there. And finally, you get to the tail and you see if there's any different colors there. Is there white on the outside of the tail? Is it long and pointed? Does it have a notch in it? Is it short and stubby? Any little differences you can see in the tail are important to note. Length is definitely a important thing to note if you can, as well as if it has white outer tail feathers. That's an important field mark. And then after you've done this sweep of the bird, you'll want to just look around at the habitat and use that as a final elimination part of your identification process. And likely you'll have done this to some extent beforehand because you are walking through the environment. You have to take at least some note of it. But that is another way to help determine what bird you're looking at. If you see a big, tall, gray bird that's 4 or 5 feet tall, and that's all you've been able to see of it, but you notice where it's standing, you can tell it apart from some very similar looking birds. If that's the only impression you've gotten, is it's tall and gray. If it's alone by itself standing in the middle of a pond, that's probably a great blue heron. If it's either by itself or in a group, but standing out in the middle of a big open field, not anywhere near water, you're probably looking at a sandhill crane. So somewhat similar birds, but very vastly different habitats, and that can help you do that process of elimination. And it also just helps you eliminate parts of the field guide you need to look through. If you're in the middle of a forest, you most likely don't need to be looking at all the gulls and terns and seabirds in that section of the guide. So you can go back and look at birds that are likely going to be in the area that you're standing in. And then finally, as I've said already, note if it's making any sounds. Is it going peep? Is it going pip? Is it making this really long melodious call? Is it chipping at you? Is it squeaking? Any different types of sounds you can note can help you identify this bird. And that can be before or after you see the bird. But usually when I see a bird, I'll either hear it coming and track it down by its sound, or I'll see the bird and then notice if it's singing there or hear it after it flies away, because birds do have this somewhat annoying habit of not always holding still. So all these field marks you have to get as quickly as possible, and that it'll take time. You won't get it right off the bat, but eventually if you practice enough, you'll be able to absorb these field marks fairly quickly and translate them either into a bird that you already know or into a part of the field guide that you should probably look in to determine what exactly the bird is that you're looking at. Might be able to recognize that the bird is a sparrow, but not know the exact sparrow, but still that narrows it down, and you can look in that part of the field guide to see if it matches up to any of the sparrows that should be in our area. Now, I do want to touch just quickly on basic birding rules and birding etiquette. This usually is fairly common sense stuff, but in all my years of birding and going to big birding hotspots, it seems like there's always a small percentage of people that either don't know or just don't care about the rules. So first off, when you're birding, be considerate of the birds. We're out there to enjoy the birds and to enjoy them doing their natural behavior in their natural environment. You don't want to disturb the birds and throw off their natural behavior just so you can look at them. It's not as much fun for you. You see a scared bird running away from you, and it's not great for the birds either. And if you scare the bird away, it ruins the enjoyment for other people that may want to see that bird as well. So be sure to keep your distance from any of the birds. The bird will kind of let you know if you're getting too close. It'll start fidgeting around or moving away from you. If the bird's moving away from you, unless it's obviously just foraging along an edge, if it's trying to actually escape you getting too close, don't keep chasing after the bird. Just let the bird go away. Use your binoculars, or if the bird is out of sight, well, the bird is out of sight. You can wait around for it to come back. You can walk slowly around to see if you can see it from a different angle, but don't keep chasing and harassing the bird if it obviously is saying that you're too close. Of course, do not disturb nest areas or habitat unless you're doing nest box surveys or have some reason to get close to a nest. If you notice that there is a nest there, be sure to keep your distance so the bird can come in, and if it needs to feed chicks, take care of the chicks. If it has to go through and excuse me, if it needs to do any of its normal behaviors around the nest, just let it do that. Nice. Just saw a question, tell which bird is in each photo. Yes, let me scroll back and I'll identify these birds. The one, when I start talking about specific birds, I will definitely get into that a little more. These are mostly just pictures to make it not quite as boring. But this first one here is a scrub jay. When I took the picture, it was a western scrub jay, but they have since split it into two separate species. So it is now a Woodhouse's scrub jay, which is all the scrub jays here in Central Texas are going to be Woodhouse's scrub jays. This is a magnolia warbler, a picture I took here in Wimberley during spring migration. The one here on top in the parts of the bird is a golden crowned kinglet. Then the one with the crest is Pyrrhuloxia, and the really nice colorful one on the bottom is a painted bunting. And the wings, I'm not exactly sure which wings those are. It looks like one of the bottom one might be a teal, the top one, maybe one of the buntings. And then this one is a least flycatcher. I just picked this picture because the bird looks shocked, and I wanted to make sure it fit in with the birding rules. Don't disturb the birds. This was, I caught it mid-call. So, which does come to my next point, is call playback. This is a somewhat contentious topic between birders. Some people say that any recorded playback at all is harassment of the birds and should not be used in any circumstance. Others say it doesn't harm the birds at all, and you can blast recorded calls all over the place and it doesn't matter. And the birds will come in and then they'll go back to doing their thing. Me personally, I somewhat stay towards the middle. If you don't need to use playback, don't use playback. It does cause the birds to come in closer to you, and it does cause them to stop doing whatever they were doing. If you are in a public location, I would say don't use playback either. For one, because if you're using it there, there's probably other birders that will use it there as well. And if it's just one person using playback for one bird at one time, won't harm the bird. It takes a few seconds out of its day to come look at what that other bird's sound is, and then it goes back to doing what it was doing. But if multiple people are doing it multiple times a day, then that bird can't do whatever else it needs to do because it's thinking it's defending its territory, it's coming in to chase off this intruder, and it's never there. So that can be a little bit of harassment. And also, if you are playing the song of a rare bird and there's another birder around, you might get a very excited birder running down the trail and then get somewhat cross with you because he thought that he had just heard a really interesting bird, and in fact it was just your phone playing the sound. So if you're on your own property and there's a bird that you really want to see but it's just not cooperating at all and you play one call, it's not going to harm the bird. But if you're somewhere public, unless you're doing a scientific research study or have other permission to do it there for a specific reason, I would avoid using call playback. And do note that in certain places like state parks and certain federal lands, it is illegal to use bird playback. So definitely avoid it there. Next, I want to talk about being considerate of other birders. And let's see, playback might also alert predators to birds. Yes, that is a good point. If you are using playback, it can alert other things that there might be a bird there and it can come in. And I have heard stories of people playing songs and a bird coming in and then a hawk coming down and eating that bird that they were watching it. So might have made that hawk's day a little easier, but it wasn't so good for the bird that you were trying to call in. So I generally avoid using playback unless there is some very specific need for it, like if you're doing research. Like I said, be considerate of other birders. You can share information. Birders are a generally helpful bunch. If you need help identifying something, there's another birder around, feel free to ask for help or ask for an opinion. If you see someone struggling with an identification, but you know what that bird is, it's usually perfectly acceptable to go say, well, have you considered such and such bird might be this one? But do be careful with what information you share. Some areas are sensitive. Don't share sensitive nesting locations. If it's a rare bird that's nesting somewhere and you find the nest, don't publish the GPS coordinates or tell people exactly where it goes. If you tell a friend, that might not be so bad as long as you know they're trustworthy. But if you publish it online, there are untrustworthy people who might, at worst, try and come rob the nest, or might come try and take pictures and get too close and disturb the birds, or you just get a huge crowd of people if it's a really rare bird. So just be considerate of the information you share, but don't be afraid to share some information with birders, especially if there's an interesting bird and it's up in the tree and it's, hey, look, there's a red-faced warbler sitting up in the tree over here. It's usually considered good form to talk to other birders about their identifications and share identifications. And finally, be considerate of non-birders. Again, I'll mention the bird reports. If you see a rare bird and it's on someone's private property, ask them before you tell anyone about the bird. Most birders will respect private property, and you should respect private property. Don't walk on someone's land just because there's a rare bird. But also be careful where you're submitting your sightings from, because if you report an unusually rare bird and it goes out onto some of the rare bird alerts, some birders will start driving there before the sighting is even 10 seconds old because they want to see the bird, and they might not necessarily know it's on private property, and your friend or whoever's land you're on may not be so happy about 10 different cars coming up their driveway because someone reported a rare bird on their backyard. So be careful where you're reporting your sightings, and be careful where you're walking. Don't wander onto private property. This is Texas after all, and no matter how rare the bird is, it's not worth getting shot. And finally, be careful where you're pointing those binoculars. There might be an interesting bird on a twig there, but if there's someone's bedroom window right behind the twig, you might get some unwanted attention. And also, I always like to tell the story of, I had some friends who were in the Great Texas Birding Classic years and years ago. This was it was 2002, I believe, and they were looking at these ducks in a pond. They were driving down the road and they saw this great big pond full of ducks. They pulled out, they had their cameras ready, their binoculars, their spotting scopes all set up. They were looking at the ducks, having a great time. And then all these cop cars pulled up and surrounded them, because apparently that was a cooling pond for a nearby power plant. And this was recently after 9/11. So they were somewhat concerned about a group of people with large optical equipment staring at what they thought was staring at the power plant. And then they had to explain why they were looking at the ducks in explain what bird watching was. So just remember that not everyone is a birder and knows exactly what you're doing with those binoculars. So I won't go into too much of this since we don't have a whole lot of time to do my every in-depth presentation here. Setting up your yard, you can put up plants, you can put up feeders. If you want to get really close-up looks at birds, feeders can be a great way to do that. Just be sure to keep them clean. If you do put feeders out there, you don't want dirty, moldy feeders making the birds sick. And feeders don't always attract all different types of birds, but water does attract a massive amount of birds. You can get things like warblers that don't come to feeders. You can even get hawks that show up to take a bath in your water feature. So putting a bird bath, especially if it's got a little bit of water dripping into it to make a little bit of noise, works really, really well to attract all different kinds of birds, and you can get great pictures. Let's see, it looks like we're having issues. Someone lost pictures. Is everyone else still able to see my screen?
I think most are. Linda, if you
Okay.
want to try to disconnect and rejoin and see if that fixes your problem, I think the rest of us can still see.
Okay, as long as it's not a everyone wide problem, let me know if you want me to restart the screen share or something. And if you're trying to attract birds, native plants work really, really well for bringing birds into your backyard. Native plants are hardy, they're good to have around, and they bring in large amounts of birds because that's what the local birds are used to be eating. Uh, Finally, other habitat is really good. You can put up shade, you can put up bird houses, rock piles, brush piles, and even your house. This is a barn swallow, which is very well known for nesting over people's front porches. They do make a little bit of a mess, but they do eat a lot of mosquitoes and they're fun to have around. So if you do have barn swallows coming to your front porch, I would recommend leaving them there. Get a power washer, clean off the porch every now and then. Or if you want to encourage them to move a little bit to the side, you can put up a little wooden platform under your eaves that gives them a little place to build their nest where it's not directly over your front door. And if you do have a cat, either keep it inside or put a bell collar on it or something so it does not sneak up and eat all these wonderful, beautiful birds that you are working to attract to your yard. Now, unless there's any other questions on that, I will move on to talk about specific common birds. Now, this one is one that most of you have probably seen and probably heard. This is the great-tailed grackle. It's commonly found in urban environments. Their natural habitat is actually more swampland, but they've adapted really well to urban areas. So you'll see them flying around most cities here in Central Texas. If you go through Austin, certain times of the year, you might see several thousand by the time you get to the other side. They are a very common bird. This one here in the picture is a male. This is very glossy black, as the name suggests. They have a very long tail. The female looks similar, but she's more brown instead of that glossy black. Let's see, I got a question here. Have 1/2 oranges worked for you, and what did they attract in Georgetown area? Well, I'm down in Wimberley, but you would get about the same stuff that would come through my backyard here. Usually during spring migration or fall migration this time of the year, you can get things like orioles. There will be the occasional Baltimore oriole coming through. You'll get sometimes in the summertime here, all summer long, you can get Scott's orioles. You can get orchard orioles during migration. And it was, so orioles are a main one. You can get tanagers coming in. I haven't had a huge success with different types of species in my backyard coming to the oranges besides the occasional orioles. But if you go further out into West Texas, for some reason out there, stuff like the Pyrrhuloxia, the cardinals, verdin, they all love the fruit coming into the oranges. But usually I put it out during migration and do luck into a few orioles that show up. So back to the grackle. So male, dark glossy black. Female is a little bit smaller and more brownish, and usually they're not found individually. You'll see them in big flocks, and they're very loud. Now I'm going to play the sound, and hopefully it will come through with decent audio quality. So it sounds very mechanical and lots of clicks, buzzes, and very interesting noises. Almost sounds like a car alarm more than a bird. And they'll just keep making all these different noises over and over, moving from one to the next to the next. There's not any specific pattern that they follow, but you'll just hear these blurry, buzzy, mechanical, kind of grating sounding, buzzing calls coming from the grackles. And a lot of times, especially in the spring when they're doing this, you'll see them dancing around. The males will puff up their feathers and flutter their wings out to the side, and then they'll throw their heads straight back over their back and make these great big gurgling noises. So it's a common sound around cities. I don't see these or hear these out in the country very often, but if you have not noticed the grackles in town, take some time next time you go in, even if it's just on a shopping trip and you watch them walking around the Walmart parking lot. They're actually fairly pretty birds. They've got that glossy color to them. They've got interesting behavior. So don't just dismiss it as just another grackle, but take a few minutes or a minute or however much time you have, listen to it and watch their behavior. They're actually really funny little birds to watch go around their daily life.
Say, Jesse, I don't know if adjusting your playback volume up a little bit would help, but this playing, but it's rather low volume right now.
Oh, okay. We'll try it with the Cardinal next, and it might just be that it's audio compression or something. I don't know how Zoom handles that. It's probably not set up exactly for playing bird sounds over it. And if anyone's following along on their computer, if you go to allaboutbirds.com or just search online bird field guide, you can listen to songs on your own computer. Might come through in a little bit better quality than over the Zoom call. If you're having trouble hearing it, you can just search, for instance, Northern Cardinal and come up with a whole bunch of different songs there. So Northern Cardinal, they're another common bird. They're a very common feeder bird. You see them in wooded areas. You'll get them in urban areas, not generally in big, really heavily built up urban areas, but in parks and suburbs, and definitely all out in the countryside over the hill country. You get lots and lots of Northern Cardinals. Now the male, of course, is in the picture here. He is bright, bright red. And one of the main field marks you'll notice on him is he has a crest. He has a great big crest sticking off the top of his head. The male and the female both have this crest, and they also have a great big orange bill. That orange bill is present in both the male and the female. The female, however, instead of being red, is more brownish. She does have it's a very warm brown with kind of a buffy wash, but she is not red like the male is. She's plain brown. I've got a picture of her coming up here in a little bit, but she still has that bright orange bill. The only time you won't see the orange bill is on freshly hatched and fledged youngsters. For the first month or two, their bills will be slate black, and then they'll slowly turn orange over time. But just notice the size of the bill and that great big crest and a little bit of the body shape, medium-sized tail, fairly plump body, and just that the silhouette of that giant beak with the crest is enough to identify it as a cardinal here in Central Texas. You get more out to West Texas, you get Pyrrhuloxia. Their beaks are not as pointed. They're curved on the end and not as sharply pointed as in the Northern Cardinals. And they're usually seen individually, or you get them in small groups. And I'll play the sound here. And let me try turning my volume. So usually a two-note, do-weet, do-weet, do-weet. Or you can go the other way and descend like that one. And then they have a little trill that they'll do sometimes. And they do that little buzz at the end of their songs. And then this is their chip note. This is a contact call. And that chip note is one that you'll hear very often anytime you go walking in the woods. That's when they're moving as a flock, but when they're not singing, the males sing their song as kind of a territorial thing, or as, look at me, I'm over here. But that little chip note is how the flocks keep in contact with each other, saying, I'm here, I'm here, I'm here, I'm still alive, I'm still alive. There might be food over here. You'll hear that chip, chip, chip. It's a very short and sharp chip. Lots of birds have chip notes, but the cardinal's chip is very, very sharp. So next time you see a cardinal, just pay attention to the little noises it's making and try and commit that little chip, chip, chip to memory. The song is usually going to be a two-note, either rising or falling, do-weep, do-weep, do-weep. And it sounds kind of like I don't like saying low quality, but as a more blurry kind of a dime store whistle versus a high-tuned instrument. It's not clear, but it's just this pretty little, somewhat blurry do-weep, 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 as compared to something like a Carolina wren, which can do a two-note or a three-note call, but it's much clearer and it rings a lot louder than the cardinal does. Now we'll move on to another little guy that also frequently comes to feeders here in Central Texas, and that is the Carolina chickadee. If you are from up north or currently up north, you will probably have the black-capped chickadee up there. They're almost identical to the Carolina chickadee. They're mostly separated by range. The black-capped chickadee is about 1/2 inch larger than the Carolina chickadee. So if you catch one and measure it, that's the most reliable way to tell them apart if in the range overlaps. But here in Texas, we just have the Carolina chickadee. They come to feeders a lot. You see them in the woods a lot. And their field marks are these very strikingly white cheeks with a very dark black cap and a dark black throat. And notice the beak. It is tiny. They've got this tiny little beak. So unlike the cardinal, which has this huge beak made for crushing through seeds, these little chickadees, they can't just grab a seed and crush it in their beak. So their behavior, especially on your feeders, they'll fly in, they'll grab a seed, they'll fly over to a perch, they'll hold the seed down, and then they'll just peck away and they'll hammer away at that seed to break into it because they don't have the crushing strength with their beak, but they're still mostly seed eaters, but they do it by pecking and breaking into the seed. So that's a behavior you'll see a lot with the chickadees. And they forage a lot in moderate sized flocks and mixed flocks. Usually chickadees are great indicators. If you see or hear a chickadee, take a few minutes to look around the area because frequently other birds will join in with them. The chickadee will start foraging through, a couple chickadees will get together, make a bunch of noise. Other birds will hear that and they'll come in and start joining with this flock and make this big mixed flock of birds that will be moving around through the forest and foraging. So whenever I hear chickadees, I always take some time to go look and see what other birds are there. Now, chickadee I really like because some of its calls, it is chickadee. So it tells you its name. Let me play it if my computer will play it. There we go.
What do you want me to play?
Chickadee. Chickadee. Let's see, the next one is, this is kind of their squeaky, fussy call. You can still hear chickadee-dee-dee-dee-dee, chickadee-dee-dee-dee-dee-dee. And I don't have the recording on here, but another one that they do is just this really weird, garbly, you can look that one up online likely and find that one. But if you hear something that's going chickadee, chickadee-dee-dee-dee-dee, well, you're probably listening to a chickadee. It's one of those nice birds that identifies itself for you. And one other bird that the chickadee usually hangs around with is the black-crested titmouse. Now, this is another common feeder bird. They have a lot of the same behaviors as the chickadee. Note that one of the main field marks on this bird, again, is a very large crest on the top of its head, much like the cardinal. This is our second most common crested bird. The cardinal is going to be our most common one. Then this little guy will be around here. But note the size and shape of the bill. It's much different from the cardinal. It's about the size and shape of a sunflower seed, which is one of their favorite foods to eat. But it's nowhere near the size of that massive conical bill that the cardinal has. So even if you just see a silhouette of this bird, you see the crest, you see the beak, it's obviously not a cardinal. The beak is too small. Black-crested titmouse is a little bit smaller than a cardinal in size as well, but size, overall size of a bird is somewhat hard to tell at a distance. So I don't usually go based on size unless it's something very obvious, like a heron that's obviously gigantic. But this one, as the name suggests, one of its main field marks is the crest is black. And I'll get to why this is important in a second. The crest is black, and the lores, which is the part right over the forehead, light right over the forehead is called the lores. That's just the name of the field mark. And I've got another question here. Here, chickadees are all hybrids. Actually, that correction there is titmice. The titmice are hybridized here in Central Texas, and that I'm going to talk about here in just a second. Chickadees here are all going to be Carolina chickadees, unless you are way out in West Texas where you might have mountain chickadees coming in, or very, very far north, you might have black-cap chickadees. But as far as chickadees here in Central Texas, they're all going to be Carolina chickadees. But the titmice, yes, we're right here in the hybrid zone, which I'm going to talk about in just a second. So do note the lores on the black-crested titmouse are very light colored, very light buffy, but not much distinction there. Actually, here I can draw on the screen. The lores are that thing right there. Those are the lores. And they're usually found in small groups, sometimes mixed flocks. They'll be with the chickadees. They like making lots of noise with the chickadees and moving around with the chickadees. So you'll see lots and lots of titmice in with the chickadees. And let's listen to their sound, if this thing will play again. Kind of sounds like Peter, 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 Peter. And then they also have a fussy chit, 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 kind of similar to the chickadees, but it's a little bit harsher in the titmice. But usually their song, you'll see them sitting up on the top of the tree, Peter, 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 and then chit, 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 which if you mimic, it's called pishing. You can go, sounds like a wren or an angry titmouse. They'll usually fly in and try and see what that scolding sound is, and you can get a good look at them. Now, the other titmouse that's here in Central Texas is the tufted titmouse. These both used to be the same species, but then they split them apart into the black-crested titmouse and the tufted titmouse, and they are genetically different, so that's why they split them. And of course, an obvious difference is the crest. The crest on the tufted titmouse is gray. It's pure gray. The crest on the black-crested titmouse is jet black. And note the lores on the tufted titmouse right over the beak are dark, dark black on the lores. So if you see jet black lores and pure gray crest, you're looking at a pure tufted titmouse. But right here in Central Texas, it extends to about 30 miles on either side of I-35, going from Dallas down to Austin to San Antonio and over to Corpus Christi. We get a hybrid zone, and these birds have been hybridizing for many thousands of years. So a large portion of the titmice in this area are going to be hybrids, and telling them apart and determining what a hybrid is and is not, and which one is a pure titmouse, can be fairly difficult. I've spent a lot of time looking at titmice, and I rarely, at least here in the Wimberley area, ever see any pure tufted titmice. Mostly what I see are hybrids that trend towards the black-crested titmouse. I do occasionally see pure black-crested titmouse here that are pure as far as I can tell. I haven't done genetic testing on them, but they have all the trademarks of a pure black-crested titmouse, which is jet black crest and almost no coloration on the lores. If you see a very deep buffy or russet color on the lores, but still a dark crest, that's a hybrid. If you see one with jet black lores like this one, but with more coal color on the crest, again, that's a hybrid. And it's a whole spectrum, because these birds have been hybridizing and hybridizing among the hybrids for many, many years. So it's a whole spectrum of birds. And just to shamelessly plug my YouTube channel, if you go to the Huth Avian YouTube channel, I recently uploaded a video on the many differences between these hybrid titmice and talk a little bit about determining how the scientists usually rate them and determine their different field marks and where you can go to see one or the other. So if you are in Georgetown or Austin and you drive west for an hour, you're probably just going to be looking at black-crested titmice. If you drive east for an hour, you're just going to be looking at tufted titmice. So if you want to be sure you've got a pure version of each titmouse on your birding list, if you keep a list, it's easiest just to drive a little bit out of our current area. Otherwise, you can log it on eBird as tufted / black-crested titmouse, or log it as a hybrid if you do eBird at all. Now we'll move on from the titmice. Usually I do identification challenges here, but since it's not as much fun if people can't yell it out around the room, I'll just play it so you can see the differences. This is a chickadee, Carolina chickadee. You can hear him going chickadee-dee-dee, pecking at a little seed and then hopping off to the side to peck it open on a branch. Then over here is the black-crested titmouse. You can see it's got very light colored lores. It's a little buffy, but they can have a little bit of buffy there as long as it's not well defined. Very deep black crest. and very curious little birds. They're always looking around, trying to see what's going on there. And if you notice, the crest moves up and down. It's not in a fixed position. They can raise it and lower it. So sometimes it's not quite as obvious as other times, depending on the mood that the bird is in. So now our next bird, everyone's bird that they love to hate, the brown-headed cowbird. This one is found in many areas all over the place. Usually it likes either open fields or edge habitat. It doesn't like going deep into the forests, but it'll be found around forest edges and, of course, all over big open fields. The male, shown here, is glossy black with a brown head. The female is more brownish overall, but the same general shape. And note how that bill is long and pointed. At first glance, you might think it looks kind of like a cardinal bill, but the cardinal's bill is much thicker at the base. This one is more extended, pointed out, and of course this bird doesn't have a crest. It's a very smooth forehead, and that beak goes almost straight up into the forehead. There's no peak to the forehead that the beak joins into. It's just a gentle slope right up over the top of its head. So in a silhouette, if you see that where the beak just merges straight into the head, very rounded head, rounded breast, and smooth back, the cowbirds in general look very, very sleek and smooth. Usually you'll see them in small groups, either flying around, perched on power lines, or foraging on the ground. When they're pecking on the ground and foraging, a lot of times you'll see them sticking their tail almost vertically up in the air. They'll raise their tails up really high. That's a generic blackbird trait. Brewers, blackbirds, and such will do that as well. But you can know you're not looking at something like a sparrow if you see a flock of birds with their tails all sticking up in the air. It's not a starling, it's not a grackle. You're looking at some type of blackbird or cowbird. Now, the reason people don't like this bird, which some of you may know and some may not, is that it is a nest parasite. This bird does not build its own nest, does not raise its own young. It finds another bird's nest, it lays its egg in that other bird's nest, and then it leaves. The cowbird chick hatches out, pushes the other nestlings out of the nest, and then screams really loud until the parent bird, that whichever one is being parasitized, comes back and feeds the cowbird chick, and it spends months of its time raising this cowbird chick instead of raising its own. This has been a big impact to the endangered golden cheek warbler and the black-capped vireo, and there's, I think, about 150 songbirds that will be preyed upon by the cowbird. And the cowbird is vengeful as well. So if you do have a nest box, even you have bluebirds or titmice or chickadees in it, and a cowbird egg shows up in it, you might first think that you should take that egg out of the nest and get rid of it because you don't want the cowbird nesting in there. But about half of the time, the cowbird will come back and check on the nest. And if the egg is gone, the cowbird will destroy the nest. So they are vengeful little things. So don't take the cowbird egg out of the nest and throw it away. But what you can do, take a cowbird egg, shake it up, and put it back in the nest. Egg won't hatch. The cowbird doesn't know that. And it is a migratory bird. It is a native bird. It's not invasive, but it is listed under exceptions on the Migratory Bird Treaty Act as a bird that is overpopulated and can be population controlled. And there is a cowbird trapping program here in central Texas, or well, all over Texas. You can get a free permit to set up cowbird traps if these are a problem bird in your area. It's free. You do an online course and you get a permit to trap cowbirds, and then you can trap and dispatch the cowbirds as you like. But one thing I do like about them is their song. And it'll play. It almost sounds like a drop of water. It's a very pretty sound. And that's their flight call. They do that little chattery flight call whenever they fly and take off and zip away. Let's move on to the next one. This one's a bit different from the cowbird. This is a sandhill crane. I talked about these a little bit already, but sandhill crane is a very large bird. They're 4.5, 5 feet tall, and they're found in big open fields or migrating at very high altitude. In fact, we'll probably be getting some of the southward bound sandhill cranes coming over any day now. Actually, I think I did hear some last week. They're a very large bird, gray overall with red right on the top of the head. And they're usually seen in very large flocks. Let me play the sound for you. So if you're outside in your yard, you can listen for this. It's a very echoey, deep, trilling sound. And it carries for miles when they're flying. So if you hear this sound and you look up in the sky where you hear the sound is coming from, just like with planes where you hear them over here, but the plane has already moved several degrees further away, the sandhill cranes do the same thing. They could be miles up in the air, and by the time that sound reaches you, they have moved beyond where the sound is coming from. So it might take a little bit of looking around in the sky, but you'll see these big flocks of them coming overhead soon. And they'll be coming down here, and some of them will winter here in central Texas. If you go up to Granger Lake area, there's usually a lot of sandhill cranes that winter up there, and the occasional whooping crane will winter around Granger Lake as well. They haven't for the last couple years, but they do show up there from time to time. You can check the TextBirds email list or go on eBird and see if there's any reports of them there. They might be showing up here as winter gets closer. Now a very, well, not very similar, but a somewhat similar bird, it's gray and it's big, is the great blue heron. Now at first glance, just as a cursory driving by glance, you see a big gray bird. This one is the one I was talking about earlier that prefers water. Great blue herons are almost always found near water, or flying to water, or flying over a forest to get to water. They like being right at the water's edge or in the water. They're a large, slaty gray bird. Do note that there is no red on the head like the sandhill crane has, and this has more black down along the wings, and it's got more feathers sticking out. The sandhill crane is very sleek looking, while the great blue heron has got some little rough feathers on his neck. He's got little plumes coming out the back of his head, and they're usually by themselves. You might see one or two sitting around a pond, but you won't see them together in a great big flock. If you see a bunch of big gray birds sitting out in a field, sandhill crane. You see one or two big gray birds sitting around a pond, that's great blue heron. And they're usually, unless they're pairing up and feeding chicks, they're usually by themselves. And I'll play their sound. That's just a startled call of a heron. You usually don't hear herons when they're just sitting around the pond. They don't usually make noise. But if you're walking down a trail near a pond, or you're in a kayak or in a canoe and going down the river, and you hear this very startled sounding bird going grick, grick, grick as it's trying to get away from you, that's usually the great blue heron. That's their alarm sound, and they'll make that sound usually when they get disturbed. Now, another one is the cattle egret. I put this one in here because I don't want people to confuse it with the brown-headed cowbird. They're two very different birds. The cattle egret, it hangs around with cows, as you can see in the picture here. It'll also hang around with lawn mowers. If you see people mowing a big field, you might see a big group of cattle egrets following behind it. And that's because whatever big animal or machine it's following behind, they do that because they chase the grasshoppers that get scared up. Grasshopper jumps up out of the grass as a cow walks by or as a lawnmower goes by, and you'll see all the egrets running around trying to catch it. That's just usually how they find their food. So you'll usually see them hanging around in big open fields with cattle, or sometimes just by themselves. They're a medium-sized white bird, a little bit bigger than a chicken. They've got orange legs during breeding season, kind of more yellowish out of breeding season. They've got a yellow bill, and they've got little buffy patches on their throat and on their nape, the back of their neck during breeding season. As it's coming into winter now, they'll mostly just be white with that yellow beak and greenish yellow legs. Usually not by themselves. You'll see them in moderately large flocks, anywhere from 5 to 50 birds. And they don't have to be near water. They can be near water sometimes. You'll see them in marshy areas, but they'll also be out in the middle of big open fields. Most of the other egrets that we have, the snowy egret and the great egret, are the other two white egrets that we have around here. They usually stay near water. You won't see those out in the middle of a big open field. So if you see egrets, big flock of them out in the field, you're looking at cattle egrets. you see a couple white egrets standing around a pond, take a little bit closer look and see if they have a dark beak. It's probably going to be a snowy egret. Dark legs with yellow feet is a snowy egret, and more great blue heron sized is going to be a great egret. I'll play their song, but again, they're not really one that vocalizes much. Usually you'll hear this vocalization around breeding areas when they make a little rookery where a bunch of these birds get together and build their nests all in one area. You'll hear them chattering and talking to each other, or sometimes just out in the field. If a cow disturbs them, they'll make a little bit of a noise, but not the most vocal of birds. Now, got one more bird here. This is another urban bird that many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with. If not, next time you go into town and buy your groceries, after you're done looking at your grackles, take a look at your house sparrows. This is your Walmart nesting bird. If you see those big, messy nests hanging out of department store signs, those are house sparrows. If you see these little fluttery birds nesting in stoplights or in gas stations, those are usually going to be your house sparrows. Now, the male shown here has a large black throat. It has a conical bill and gray on the head. They've got a very russet red nape on the back of the head and kind of reddish on the back. And their flight pattern is very different from all the other sparrows here, because this is not a native bird. This is sometimes called an English sparrow. It's because it was an introduced species. It's an old world sparrow from Europe. It wasn't originally here in the States. It's not related to any of our other native sparrows, but it was brought over here. It was released and it's taken off across the country. And its flight pattern is kind of like a little cannonball on wings. It is not graceful. Our sparrows here are, they're not as graceful as a swallow, but they still have a very controlled flight. You'll see them either fluttering across the top of the grass or darting around or flying with purpose towards a perch. These little guys, they kind of launch themselves into the air. They have a very fast, fluttery, blurry flight, and it's almost like they're just hurling themselves through the air. They're little cannonballs with wings, and when you go to Walmart next time, or anytime you go into town, just take a second and watch the house sparrows as they move around the parking lot, and you'll notice that they have this very fluttery, very almost seems uncontrolled flight there, that they just kind of hurl themselves from one place to another and control themselves with these fluttery, flappy wings. And let's play their song. It's your traditional chirping bird. Chirp, chirp, chirp. They do have a few different variations that they do. I'm not sure. I think I've got one more recording on here. Yeah. Yeah, that's their fussy scold call. But that chirp, chirp, kind of blurry two-note chirp, chirp, that is a house sparrow. And there's not very many other birds around here that make an actual chirp sound like that. So again, next time you're in town, take some time to take some notes of the house sparrows so you can quickly identify them. You rarely ever see these out of the cities. They like being in urban environments. Out here where I live in the country, I've seen them a grand total of 3 times in the 20 years I've been out here. So you won't see these out in the countryside very often, but you will see them in town. The only time I ever see them out away from cities is when they take over someone's purple martin house. They really love purple martin houses. These are little, very social birds. They're colony nesters, colony-ish nesters, and they like the big purple martin houses. So if you do have martin houses, be sure to do maintenance on them and keep the house sparrows evicted from them, or they'll take over your whole martin house. Let's see, so it's another ID challenge that I will just play the song. This is, of course, our sandhill cranes. You get them flying overhead. And then we've got our very watery, drippy sounding brown-headed cowbird. And this is the female brown-headed cowbird. All right, we've got time for a few more birds. Again, if there's anyone that has any questions, it doesn't have to be relating to the specific birds we're looking at. If you just have any birding questions in general, feel free to post them to the Q&A section. Otherwise, I'll continue talking about a few more birds here. This is another very common urban bird. If you're in a city, you've probably seen the European starlings. These, at first glance, again, kind of look like grackles. Their body size and their head size is about the same as a grackle. They're very heavy, stout birds, but they have little short tails. And I just saw the question. I'll get to it in just a second. Male and female starlings both look similar. They look like a very short-tailed grackle. Do note that I think if I get my timing right, probably here in a month or so, we're going to start seeing short-tailed grackles because for whatever reason, the great-tailed grackles molt their tails out all at once, and you get these really funny-looking short-tailed grackles flying around. So you don't confuse those with European starlings. But for the most part, the grackles will, for most of the year, will have longer tails, and the starlings will be these little short, stout, fat things. Get a closer look at the head. Obviously, it's a little bit more rounded head. The body is chunkier than a grackle instead of looking sleek. And during breeding plumage, they have these nice spots all over them. And you can get them mixed in with the grackles. You can get them mixed in with lots of different urban birds. And you see them in very, very large flocks of anywhere from 5 to 6 to 5 to 6,000. So we'll play their song, which, well, if any of you remember dial-up internet, this is what that reminds me of. It's an extremely mechanical, computer-sounding buzzes and whirs and clicks, even more mechanical sounding than the grackles. All right, so I'll answer some questions here. How can I attract a painted bunting? With luck and millet. They like, I usually just put out mixed seeds, but they like white millet. You can put that out for them. I just get the mixed seed from Sam's Club and I put that out, but it takes specific habitat. I have had 3 pairs of painted buntings nesting on my property this year because I have a great big field right on the edge of a forest. I go a mile down the road to a neighbor and they've never had a painted bunting come to their house, even though they feed the exact same things that I do. So it takes luck. Put out this right food. Mixed seed with lots of white millet in it is great for them. But water features help as well. My painted buntings love coming and taking a bath in the heat of the day, but it also takes being in the right habitat in the right area to get one to come to your environment in the first place. All right, next question is, when would be the best time of year to see the sandhill cranes at Granger Lake? Any time during the winter, I would say, is the good time to go out there. If it's cold, so after November, there should be some down there. Throughout November, December, January, February is usually when I go up there, and you'll see them not on the lake themselves, but if you drive around the fields there and just scan the fields for great big birds, you'll see the cranes there. The whooping cranes will generally be closer to the lake, and you'll see those if they're there, big white birds, even bigger than the great egrets, standing around in the lake. If you do go up there at that time of year, also pay attention to the small birds in the big farmland fields. You can get different kinds of long spurs, you can get lots of sparrows, and you can get mountain plovers. Another question. We had a Phoebe that adopted us and just kept coming to us when we went outside. Aha! They do that. It's kind of like how the cattle egrets will follow the cattle around because they stir up insects. I've had this exact same behavior happen with eastern phoebes a number of times. I have livestock, I have chickens and llamas and horses, and when I'm out working with them, I'll frequently have a phoebe come and perch on a fence post nearby me and kind of follow me around. And I've noticed that as I walk across the grassy field, if I stir up an insect, the phoebe will fly out and grab it. They're little fly catchers, so they'll sit on a perch and wait for an insect to fly up. And if they follow a big friendly mammal around, that mammal will frequently stir up insects and make it easy for them to get some food. All right, ruby-crowned kinglet visited us last year. How can I attract him again? Well, ruby crown kinglets do not eat seed, so a seed feeder won't help you there, but they do like suet. So if you put out either a block of suet or you can make your own suet, you mix lard and peanut butter and cornmeal together. You can find recipes online, or if you want to shoot me an email, I can send you my personal suet recipe. Then you just spread that on either a bark of a tree or on a specific suet feeder, and that'll frequently get the kinglets to come. Kinglets also like bird baths. You put a water dish out, even if it's cold in the wintertime, they still need to drink water. They'll come take a drink from your bird bath. And if you put out, they like live insects. So if you put out some small sized mealworms, you might have some luck getting that kinglet to come around. All right, next question is, I've seen titmice feeding large juveniles from a suet feeder. How long do they feed the juveniles? That is a good question, and it'll sometimes be several weeks after they have fledged. You will get these very large, very lazy titmouse chicks. And I've seen this with the titmice, I've seen it with the cardinals, where they will be literally sitting on the suet block begging for food. They are plenty old enough to feed themselves, but they'll still be getting the parents to feed them. And so that it kind of varies depending on the patience of the parent, I think. The little chick will be able to feed itself fairly soon after it fledges, but you'll still see them at the feeders begging for food just because they can get away with it. And as long as the birds keep coming in and feeding the young, it can be, I've seen them up to 2-3 weeks, sometimes even a month after they've been fledged. You'll get these lazy little chicks that will still be trying to get fed from their parents. Let's see, how did you end up birding at Chernobyl? Yeah, that was when I was doing my research up at A&M. I was doing my master's in poultry science, and I was really tired of people about halfway through that, and I wanted to get away for spring break, and I was thinking, where is the most farthest remote place I can get that is not associated with people in any way? And I thought, well, let's go to a radioactive wasteland. I'd always been intrigued with abandoned places. So I thought, well, the birding might be interesting there. And I've always kind of wanted to go there anyway. And that was the year they were closing up the sarcophagus. If you don't know, the original sarcophagus that they put over the reactor was collapsing. So they're building a new containment structure to go over the top of that. And since I'd always kind of been interested in seeing that, I thought that was the perfect year to go, get away for a week. So I ended up booking a 1-week trip to Ukraine, flew over there, hired a bird guide, went all around Kiev area, then went up into Chernobyl, spent 2 days up there, got to see some really interesting birds. There's tons of white-tailed eagles up there. Nature has really taken over up there, and if it weren't for all the signs saying danger radiation, you would not realize that it was a radioactive wasteland. All the life is coming back, the birds are everywhere and singing, so it's a really interesting place and wasn't anything like what I was expecting. But I got to see the reactor from a few feet away, or not a few feet away, but from a few hundred yards away, and so that was a interesting little trip overall. But I think I'm running out of time here, so I did want to, if we can squeeze in time for one last bird, I wanted to get my favorite bird in, was the golden-cheeked warbler. This is our special little bird here in Central Texas. It's endangered species, only nests right here in Central Texas. So I want everyone to be able to recognize this bird. They are found in wooded areas containing ash juniper. Usually they like slopes, so you'll find them along hillsides. As the name suggests, they have these bright golden cheeks with a single dark eye line going through the eye, black all on the head and down the nape. There is something called a black-throated green warbler that looks very similar, but it has green on the back of the head instead of black. And they're usually seen either individually or as pairs, sometimes in small groups, or when they've fledged. So I'll play the song. Oh, come on, play the song. It's a rising buzz, 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 buzz. So they're mostly gone by now, but when springtime comes around again, listen for this. This is their second call, their B call. It sounds kind of like lazy-o-daisy. So it's either a rising buzz, 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 or lazy-o-daisy. Very pretty little bird, endangered species, suffering a lot of habitat loss, and only nests right here in Central Texas. So this is our special little bird that I just absolutely love. I do surveys for them. And if springtime comes around and you want to see one and you don't know where to go, feel free to contact me. And I'm a bird guide. I can take you out on a birding trip or just tell you where to go. And let me get to my last slide here. This is my contact information. Huth Avian is my website. So if you need to contact me, have any birding questions, or just want me, or have a bird picture you don't know what it is, or need help identifying, I'm always happy to help you there. So thank you for having me. And I'm not sure if there's a official sign off for the meeting, or yep.
Yes, there is. And thank you very much for joining us. Thanks everybody for watching tonight. And we'll be back on track in September with our own Mike Farley and Kathy McCormick. Again, Jesse, thank you very much for joining us. I appreciate it. Absolutely. It was very well done. And again, in a pinch, you're the man. Thank you so much. Have a good evening.
Happy to do it. Have a good evening.
Take care. Bye-bye.